That's good to see you all again. I haven't seen any of you at all since we started doing this. Welcome back to Sussex Wildlife Trust Television. This is, I'm not sure where we are now. I think our 52nd webinar since we started doing this in November. I kind of lost count after 45, but yeah, so we've had all sorts of topics since November. We've been talking about all the great wildlife you find around Sussex. There's been bumblebees and fungi, small mammals, thrushes, nightingales, butterflies, moths, dragonflies, dung, all sorts of things. But tonight we're going back out to sea. Now, I've got to welcome back two people to give tonight's talk. Now, hopefully out there is my colleague, Sarah Ward. Is she out there?
Yes.
Sorry, you got me worried there.
Having trouble unmuting myself.
Yeah.
Pushed the button and nothing happened.
Sounds so horror. There's the horror in my mind that I've got to do a whole talk about kelp. Yeah, that could have been tricky. How are you, Sarah?
Right.
You okay?
I'm here.
Good, thank you. Good to see you, Sarah. And also, hopefully, out there, out across the border, way out west, over in Hampshire, we should have Dr. Ian Hendy.
Good evening, everyone. Delighted to be here. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Sarah, for this opportunity. Great to be here again. Very excited to give.
Yeah, actually, on that point, Ian, I mean, I've been introducing these webinars. I've been doing quite a few webinars myself, and you, of course, did a kelp webinar a few months back, and it's the only one I missed. I didn't actually. I was away on that, so I didn't think anyone would watch it. The whole webinar about seaweed. Well, no one's going to be interested, and there's about 1,000+ people watching. So, and you had so many questions. You had to do another Q&A session afterwards. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, pleasure. It was a joy, absolute joy.
Obviously, a lot of people interested out there in kelp. So before I go, just if you haven't seen our webinars before, the way it runs is I'll vanish in a second. I'll leave you to Sarah and Ian. But there is a Q&A later on at the end of the webinar. There should be a little Q&A function on your screen somewhere. If you write your questions on there, I'll write them down on my question sheet there. So any questions tonight? Really, the questions are all about the kelp recording project. If you could ask questions about the kelp recording project, I'll write them down. Hopefully at the end, I can ask Sarah and Ian to answer some of your questions. So how long is the talk tonight, Sarah, do you think?
Definitely less than an hour.
Okay. That sounds...
so hopefully plenty of time for Q&A at the end. No, it's not as long as our talk before. We're going to keep it quite succinct tonight. So.
Fair enough. Okay, well, I'll leave you to it, and I'll see you at the end and for the Q&A. So I'll catch you in a bit. Cheers.
Thank you. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and especially to those of you that have been following along this whole time. It's really exciting to be able to give a second webinar on kelp and still have loads and loads of people interested and wanting to find out what we've been up to. So I'm sure you all know this webinar is going to be specifically about recording kelp in Sussex. So the main reason that we've put this webinar on is because we've realised over the course of the last few months that there's a real appetite for people wanting to tell us what they've seen or what they haven't seen, and for us to be able to capture that information somehow. So we have been doing recording ourselves. We've got some sort of official projects, I suppose, that are inputting into the Sussex Kelp database. Some of those are through our university-led research projects. And then we've also got our citizen science project called Sea Search, which is coordinated by ourselves at Sussex Wildlife Trust, which is a citizen science project. But what we were coming to realise that there's a lot of people that want to sort of tell us what they've seen, but perhaps don't want to get involved in something quite so robust as Shore Search or Sea Search, or aren't affiliated with a project or a university. So we want to be able to create a system where you guys can still get involved with the project, tell us what you're seeing, but without having to go through any formal training or, like I say, be affiliated with these projects. So we're setting up a system at the moment. It's a really exciting system. We've contracted somebody in to sort of set it all up for us, make it as user-friendly as possible, but enable us to capture all of the information that we need to actually understand the kelp, where it's growing, where it's not growing, think about the habitats that it's growing on, and what's changed and what is changing at the moment. So it's really, really exciting. And hopefully in a few weeks' time, we're going to have a follow-up webinar, which is going to explain much more about the actual recording system. But what we want to do tonight is talk to you about kelp itself and how you can actually record it and understand what it is that you're seeing, not just in the actual kelp itself, but in the whole ecology and physical environment around it as well, and all of that information that we need to capture. My slide's going to move. There we go. Okay, so like I say, this is webinar 1 of 2. I haven't set a date for the second webinar yet, but it will be in hopefully just a few weeks or maybe a month or so's time. I didn't want to put too much pressure on getting our recording system up and running too quickly, because we are really pushing this through at a high rate of knots, but I didn't want to set a date in the diary and not have it totally ready. But do please keep an eye out for part 2. It will be hopefully before the end of the summer. So just to introduce ourselves again, if you didn't attend our last webinar or you've no idea who we are, my name's Sarah Ward. I'm Living Seas Officer at Sussex Wildlife Trust. My role is really quite all singing and dancing. I do all manner of different things marine conservation related. So like I said earlier, I coordinate Sea Search, which is a national project we run in collaboration with the Marine Conservation Society. We also run Shore Search, which is a Wildlife Trust initiative, which is essentially the same thing, but on land in the intertidal. I do all kinds of marine policy work, various other things that tie into all of the other conservation work that is done by Sussex Wildlife Trust. And of course, tonight I'm joined by wonderful Dr. Ian Hendy, who is the Marine Biology BSc course leader at the University of Portsmouth, and also works with the Blue Marine Foundation on some of their blue carbon work that they get up to. So what we're going to cover tonight in the webinar, I will talk a little bit about the project background. I'm sure if it's, like I say, if you've been following along for a while, you'll know all this, but we've got some quite interesting updates. Obviously, this webinar being part of that update to tell you, which is really exciting. And then Ian's going to take over and talk in more detail about the basics of kelp, what we're looking for, the different types of kelp that we find here in Sussex, and then the habitat in which kelp lives, and kelp itself as a habitat for other organisms. And then just at the end, we'll talk about what we're going to be doing next in terms of those other webinars and other things you can get involved in. So in terms of project background, as many of you will know, kelp used to be very extensive across the Sussex coast. The blue marks here on the map show the historical extent of where we have evidence that it existed back in the 1980s. And then to fast forward to present day, and you can see that extent has really diminished over time. So there's a whole number of different factors that has been caused by. Lots of different things, physical and otherwise, biological, that kind of thing. We've attributed to some of it to increased fishing pressure, but there are, of course, other factors of play here, things like climate change, sedimentation, that kind of thing. But what we've ended up having is what we call shifting baseline syndrome. And what that means is essentially where we've not really understood where we were to start with. It's not really been properly recorded. We don't have that evidence. So where the kelp used to be, it may even have been further out to sea. It may have been a bigger extent than that. And because it's not been sort of properly recorded, we have this, what we call shifting baseline. So we don't really understand where it is that we actually started from, where it is that we want to get back to. So one of the things we want to achieve through this project is not only understand what it should look like in its natural state, but ensure that we don't let things slip further and we're not kind of restoring to a halfway point or anything like that. So back in the 1980s, fishing boats were so heavy with fish, they often couldn't even be landed on the beach. Whereas, 1800s, not the 1980s. And then of course, fast forward to the 1980s, which is where our actual real data starts. You can see that we've got this particularly dense bed of kelp, which we showed in the last map. So dense, in fact, that often required fishers to row for 10 to 15 minutes through this kelp before they could fire up their engines, because of course, kelp being so big and thick would just tangle up in the engine and totally ruin the boat for them. So they had to paddle through it manually to get through. And then what we've got here is some information about the actual catch. So again, back in the 1980s, you can see here the amount of catch in the hours spent at sea, the numbers of nets. And then back to present day, or 2017, you can see that the same amount of nets, almost one more, but a huge amount more hours being put in. but a fraction of the amount of fish being caught with that effort. So it's a really, really big change in the effort required and the amount of fish being caught. It's crazy, crazy difference. So 10 times the amount of effort for a fifth of the return. So it's really, you can see a real marked difference in terms of just what's out there and what's being caught. So what happened is the Sussex IFCA decided to introduce a new bylaw. This is sort of almost what we've based our entire restoration project around. It was suggested because of the sort of understanding that there had been this massive change and the kelp was no longer where it used to be. It happened very slowly over time, out of sight, out of mind. And being that the Sussex IFCA were reviewing their nearshore trawling bylaw anyway, they saw this as an opportunity, which is a really, really fantastic forward-thinking way of creating bylaws. So as you can see here, this is the Sussex IFCA district, which covers the entire length of the Sussex coastline out to 6 nautical miles. And here is the trawling exclusion zone that they proposed. It's no longer proposed. As I'm sure you may be aware, the bylaw went through earlier this year. It was just such an exciting day when it finally got signed off and was a real bylaw. We'd been waiting a number of years for it, you know, from its original inception. So it's really fantastic. And what we've got here is a bylaw that extends pretty much the entire Sussex coastline. But we've got an extended area between Selsey and Shoreham, which covers the extent of where the historical kelp used to exist. So we then set up what was formerly known as Help Our Kelp, the Help Our Kelp Partnership, but we have now had a slight rebrand to better suit what it is that we're actually achieving now. So we're now known as the Sussex Kelp Restoration Project. That had a number of partners, as you can see here, and I'm really pleased to announce that the Sussex IFCA are now officially a partner on the Sussex Kelp Restoration Project. They did have to remove themselves when we were doing lobbying for the bylaw, as it was not appropriate for them to be a part of a lobbying group for their own bylaw. But now that the bylaw is through and our efforts have shifted back to the restoration project itself, we're really, really pleased to welcome back into the official circle of partners on the project. So that's really fantastic. And then, of course, more widely supporting the actual partnership here, we've got a really fantastic group of stakeholders. We've had a couple of meetings now of stakeholders, a massively enthusiastic public, which is always really helpful to have the public on board. And of course, citizen scientists, which is what tonight's webinar is all about. In terms of a timeline of how we got to where we are now, as you can see, things started right back, well, earlier than June 2018, when the Sussex IFCA put forward an informal consultation on their trawling bylaw. So just putting the feelers out, seeing if what they were suggesting was going to be taken well by the people it was going to be affecting. And then over a year and a bit later, they did their formal consultation once they'd refined their proposals. And we then launched the Help Our Kelp campaign, which hopefully many of you will have seen the wonderful video that Big Waves TV put together, which was narrated by Sir David himself, which of course really raised the public profile of that consultation and helped the bylaw get through the various levels that it needed to. So firstly, that was agreed within the Sussex IFCA itself. And it then went through the MMO and up to DEFRA, where it was eventually signed off by the Secretary of State on the 22nd of March this year. So it's now in place. And of course, now we've got a restoration project underway, which is just incredibly exciting. And I'm sure many of you will have seen, you know, lots of posts on social media of kelp actually already starting to come back in certain places, because some of that will be attributable to the fact that trawling doesn't happen over the winter generally anyway. And the bylaw came in just in time so that the new sort of season, if you call it that, of trawling for this year, which generally starts in the springtime, wasn't able to start. So it was really, really timely when it came into place. So why are we restoring the kelp? I'm sure many of you will totally have appreciation for why we want to do this, but it serves so many vital purposes. It's a crucial nursery ground for many fish and other species that perhaps are commercially important or just generally you know, we need all the fish we can get there. They're a habitat for a huge amount of marine species, not just the ones that we can actually see, but also tiny microscopic and encrusting animals that use the actual kelp itself, which Ian will talk a little bit more about later. And of course, they're really productive and diverse ecosystems. They give us a whole load of ecosystem benefits. They can help with the flow of carbon and help protect the coastline from you know, crashing of waves on the shore, that kind of thing. So many benefits of having a restored kelp forest along our coastline. And so a lot of what I've just spoken about, we call them nature-based solutions. So thinking about the biomass of kelp, the bioabundance of everything that's associated with it, the huge amount of diversity that it would bring compared to the habitat that we're seeing out there at the moment. Healthy trophic levels, so at all different levels, from the big stuff, you know, sharks, seals, that kind of thing, all the way down to the tiny microscopic and encrusting things as well. And what that does is increase the resilience of the ecosystem. So obviously there's some things that we just can't help nature to protect against certain things, like you know, changes due to climate change. Like, we can do what we can, but some things we just can't stop. But having a really healthy ecosystem like this builds resilience. So when we have dramatic storm events, when we have a really hot summer, the ecosystem is in such good shape that it's so much more resilient to these kind of changes. And that's really what we're hoping to achieve here. And so a little update on some of our current work. We recently received some funding, which is absolutely fantastic news. We received some funding through the People's Postcode Lottery, and that has enabled us to take on board a new Sussex Kelp lead in the form of Sally Ashby, who is pictured here. So wonderful Sally has hit the ground running and really done a fantastic job. She's bringing us all together. She's really sorting the project out, because there was a lot of things happening here, there and everywhere. And what she's doing is bringing us all together, taking things forward in a unilateral direction and basically organizing us all, which is really useful. And of course, coordinating all of the different activities that we're doing. And really importantly, telling the story as we go. So loads of really exciting stuff for us to be sharing on social media, for us to be sharing with you, the general public, and lots of other things that she's got in progress as well, which we'll be sharing further down the line. So seeing as we're talking about recording, science and research here tonight, I wanted to just share a couple of the projects that we've got either already underway or we've got funding for and they're about to start with regards to the actual sort of scientific side of things. So I'm going to have to move myself out of the way here, I can't see. So we've got transects with bottom-towed cameras, which are being undertaken by the Sussex IFCA. So those can be analysed and repeated annually. So transects being in the same place, so we can record any change that's happening year on year. And there's a PhD, which is going to be looking at what we're calling the carbon conveyor belts, so that the movement of carbon through these natural ecosystems. There's a PhD on the feasibility of reseeding techniques, so that if we do decide actually the kelp is needing a little bit of a helping hand to get to the point where we can get the kelp forest looking like it did, 30 years ago, we know what the different techniques are, what's going to work here in our local environment, and the best way to go about doing that. So there's a PhD starting on that. There's regular ecological surveys happening on known areas of existing or new kelp. And of course, the Citizen Science Project will be feeding into that. We're hopefully going to be tagging some key species to see how they use the area and hopefully show the change in the geographical use of the area over time once the kelp gets restored. And a really exciting part of the project, which is it's a really sort of novel and new technology, which is called eDNA, so environmental DNA, which is essentially taking a water sample and sending it off to some very clever people at a company called Naturemetrics, who are able to analyze exactly what's in the water sample through the DNA and tell us basically every single creature and plant that was found within that water sample. So really, really exciting and novel technology being used there to help us understand the ecosystem and understand it from many, many different levels as well. And finally, we're doing some work on understanding the genetics of UK kelp as well. So whether there's some variation at all, whether there's different populations, that kind of thing. So loads and loads of different research starting or already going on here. So definitely lots of things that we'll be updating you on as and when we've got more information about all of these different projects. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Ian now, and I will stop screen sharing to allow him to continue with the presentation on his end. I can see there's loads of questions that have already come through, so we'll pick back up at the end, and I'll jump back in for the Q&A. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So just to reiterate, everybody, so this talk, or these series of talks, are in two programs, as it were. So this first program, we're going to be talking about the basic ecology, the life history of kelp, and really the benefits of kelp. So the ecosystem services of what kelp can do for us, for, as Sarah says, for nature-based solutions. Then in the second webinar that we're going to deliver, we're going to be talking about how to actually collect the data. So the really exciting stuff. So the data management, if you will, going out into the field, doing the dives and actually doing the surveys. But today we're going to be talking about the basic ecology. So without further ado, let's show off my IT skills and see if I can share a screen, and hopefully this will work. Here we go. So by way of a context, guys, let's think about why for the last 2 years, in actual fact, with the Sussex Kelp Restoration Project, formerly the Help Our Kelp Group, why we were working so hard behind the scenes to do marine-based rewilding. So why was that? So let's think about our planet, okay? So if we think about the planet, 30% of it is land, okay? So a minimal part of it is land, and within the next 30 years or so, there's going to be 10 billion people on the planet. So there's an increased amount of exploitation on the resources for our land use, okay? So extra demand on what we call ecosystem services. Now, as we know, there's agriculture occurring at the minute, so increased demand on farmland, reducing the trees and natural ecosystems that we have. So looking to the land then is unlikely really for active restoration, because in another 30 years, there's going to be so many more people exploiting those resources. So in actual fact, not only do we have to become more sustainable and conservation minded, we have to look to more sustainable areas to solve these problems. So let's think of our oceans. 70% of our planet is water. So it's more likely in areas where there's less human populations, that's where we can look to restore our natural ecosystems and mitigate the impacts from climate change, for example. And so what we need to do really is change from becoming a carbon emitting society and become a more carbon absorbing society. So we need to pull our carbon belts in, if you will, and start actually reducing our carbon footprint. So we can do that, okay? And this is because at the minute, if you think about the amount of resources that we're exploiting, we're at about 1.8 worth of planets of resources that we're utilizing right now. So almost 2 planets at the minute. And of course, let's go back to the point of, 30 years from now, 10 billion people on the planet. So we're going to be needing more planets worth of resources. So we need to become more sustainable and more low impactful in our methods moving forward for future generations. And this is, as what Sarah said, actually future proofing our ecosystems, making them more resilient. So why marine ecosystems? So again, I'm just going to give a bit of context to, let's call them marine vegetated coastal ecosystems, okay? And of course, kelp is a big part of that. So around the UK, we have salt marsh ecosystems. Now, salt marsh will store about 77 tons of carbon in the size of a football pitch, okay? And they'll store that and lock it away. So that carbon would otherwise be in the atmosphere as greenhouse gases, as carbon dioxide. Seagrass can store actually up to about 100 to almost 140 tons of carbon per hectare, which is the size of about a football pitch. And they can store that carbon and lock it away in their sediments. This is because salt marsh and seagrass grow in muddy environments, and they can retain a lot of that carbon that's drawn down from the atmosphere. Kelp, on the other hand, very modest, but they can store up to about 4 tons of carbon in their tissues. And we're going to talk about the kelp tissues in a minute, but what we call the wet biomass of the fleshy parts of kelp, they can store about 4 tons of carbon per hectare per year. Okay, so this is year on year. Now, what I want you guys to do is think of the amount of carbon that's stored away in the size of a football pitch for salt marsh, seagrass, and kelp. This is the equivalent of driving one car around the planet 32 times in terms of CO2 emissions. So if you extrapolate that hectare up to 1 kilometre, and there's 100 hectares in 1 kilometre, then extrapolate those kilometres up to the size of the kelp restoration project that we have. And we want to restore about 170 square kilometres. So that's a large amount of carbon that we're trying to actually mitigate from being re-released into the atmosphere. Okay, so not only the carbon, but we're going to focus on the ecosystem services, the nature-based solutions, which I'm going to talk about in a lot more detail in actual fact. And here are the stats in actual fact of our loss of our natural ecosystems. If we carry out the same rate of loss, okay, staggering number here, by the year 2050, so 30 years from now, our bill for loss of natural nature-based solutions is going to be £8 trillion. That's the value of these very expensive and valuable ecosystem services around the planet. So we need to retain them. Not only will it benefit the conservation and the environment and the ecology, of course, but it will benefit the local economy for many millions of people around the world globally. So let's go back to kelp basics then. So let's think about this. So kelps come from a family of called the Phytophytes, so the brown algae. Okay, and we see in the UK about 7 species of kelp. In Europe, we have about 14 species. So the UK is very biodiverse in its kelp species. This is because it's very well suited to having kelp forests because of its rocky and exposed shorelines. They grow forming these vibrant and rich underwater forests, okay? Absolutely amazing places. And as I already hinted about, they grow in rocky areas, okay? And we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail as well and why they prefer rocky areas. This is because how they grow, of course. They grow in shallow waters. This is because, of course, they need UV light. They need energy from the sun to photosynthesize, which is why they can maximize their growth in these clear, shallow waters. And they grow rapidly in actual fact. And we talk about that later as well. They're what we call an ecosystem engineer. So a very fancy name for an algae that draws down atmospheric gases, okay, principally greenhouse gases. So it reduces impacts from climate change. They can create habitat for a wide biodiverse community of marine organisms, commercially important species, and also prey species feeding the wider food chain that again Sarah hinted about earlier on. So they're very important communities of algae. They create a vast what we call habitat complexity. Now think about, let's use an analogy of a farm, all right, on land. Now imagine you've got a forest and then somebody cuts that forest down and you have a basic clear field. As you can appreciate, if you've got a forest, you've got loads more animals, haven't you? This is because the structure and the function of that ecosystem is far greater when it's a forest, because you've got lots of micro niches for lots of many different organisms and animals to survive relatively safely, to avoid predation. This makes the ecosystem more resilient. But if you cut that down, you change the structure and the function, you ruin the habitat complexity. Now, kelp forest will deliver on building a really strong habitat complexity, okay? So it's the structure and the function of the ecosystem that kelp will deliver on. Now, what we have within the morphology of the kelp species that we have, they have what we call a holdfast. Now, this is because we talk about kelp growing in a rocky environment. Now, the holdfasts are integral because they really anchor the kelp to rocks. So it's not a root structure, if you will. It's this holdfast structure that actually fixes to a hard, stable substratum, okay? So it's very tough, and it has to be very tough because lots of these different species of kelp will actually grow in the low intertidal area. So at low tide, you can sometimes see kelp species thrashing about in the waves, and they need to be very strong and very flexible. That holdfast anchors them onto the rocks. And sometimes, of course, you see in big storms, some of that kelp gets washed up on our shorelines. There's a stipe, a kelp stipe, which is very similar to the tree trunk of our terrestrial trees. So here we have the stipe. So below that, we have the holdfast anchoring the kelp to the rocks. Then we have the stipe. Now, in some species, it's very flexible and very leathery. And in some species, it's very stiff. And we're going to talk about why that is. Then beyond the stipe, we have the fronds, okay? And this is why these kelps are called the laminarias, because these are called in laminas, in stripes, in lots of these kelp that we see, particularly in Sussex, in actual fact. And we're going to go through some of those species. Now, these fronds are the leaf-like structures that you'll see on a terrestrial tree, and it's these guys that will form the dense canopy on the surface, or reaching the surface of these shallow waters, and they create the photosynthetic ability of these macroalgae. And there we have the dense fronds here, creating this large, thick, dense forest of this particular species. So what about the kelp life cycle then? So what we have is a mature sporophyte, a mature kelp plant. And what they do is release their zoospores. Okay, so male and female gametes will be released into the water column. And then we have fertilization occurring, okay? This then creates these juvenile sporophytes, which will then settle on any available hard substrata. Now, that's very important because what we want is a dense mixture of these sporophytes in the water, these adult kelps releasing their spores into the water column, then settling in areas where it's bare. And of course, as Sarah's already said, now that we've got this bylaw over the line and we're actually reducing the detrimental impact in the extractive activities, we should now see kelp giving a chance to come back. And anecdotal evidence, by the way, is suggesting that it is coming back already, and we're seeing that. And local divers are actually telling us this, so it's very exciting. And what we have, of course, is the growth of mature sporophyte after that, and then the cycle repeats itself over and over again. So very exciting stuff. So we have in Sussex three particular species, or three main species. And our first species, Laminaria hyperborea, otherwise known as tangleweed. Now, what you see are its fronds here, okay, very long, and it's these that create the photosynthetic ability here. Now, this particular species, tangleweed or Laminaria hyperborea, will grow at depths of about 10 to 30 meters. And kelp will actually, depending on the species, will form a zonation in different areas, okay? So we're going to see the different types of species that you can see depending on where you are in the shoreline. Now, the actual stipe is quite stiff, okay, for this particular species. This is because it needs to stay upright in the water column to maximize the UV light underwater, because it grows to about 10 to 30 meters of depth. And this species can go up to about 9 feet in length. The other common species that we have is Laminaria digitata. Now, you could be forgiven that it looks very similar to Laminaria hyperborea. Okay, this is because of the laminarias, it looks very similar, but this particular species is often more broad in its fronds. Okay, so you can see it's got many more fronds, and in actual fact, the stipe of this species of Laminaria digitata is a lot more flexible. This is because this species is found further up the shoreline. So it's found in shallower waters. It's actually found at the spring low tide mark. So at spring low tide, you can actually see dense canopies of these particular species. Now, the reason why you've got this very leathery, flexible, but strong stipe is because when you've got the waves crashing in shallow water, it needs to anchor itself so it gets thrown about and it doesn't get broken off. So if you had a stiff, brittle stipe, it would get broken off a lot more easily. Then we have a third species, so Saccharina latissima, okay? And this species, otherwise known as sugar kelp, actually favors low light environments. We're going to talk about why. And what you can see is actual fact, its morphology is distinctly different to those of the laminaria species of Laminaria hyperborea and Laminaria digitata. This is because it doesn't have these finger-like fronds. It has one large broad frond. So it's very opportunistic in where it can survive and thrive, okay? Because it can maximize its photosynthetic ability because it has a broader surface area. These guys, or these species, can be found in estuaries, shallow, low energy environments, in bays, and also in deeper water. So you'll see this zonation of Laminaria hyperborea between 10 to 30 meters. Then you'll see Laminaria digitata in shallower waters, fringing the edge of Laminaria hyperborea. And then from coastal bays to estuaries going out to deeper waters, you can find Saccharina latissima as well. So we see this kind of zonation pattern. But we also have other species in and around the UK that we thought, Sarah and I thought we would kind of express and show to you. We also have Alaria esculenta. So this can be found at about 0 to 8 meters depth. And we do see some species in and around Sussex. It can be up to 3 or 4 meters length. Okay, and actual fact, you could be forgiven that it is Saccharina latissima. Okay, but this species is a lot more corrugated, is a lot more reticulated. So that's really a posh word for wrinkled. You can see here in its fronds, he's got these corrugated type patterns on it. Okay, so it is slightly different to Saccharina latissima. We also have Chordophyllum. Okay, so mermaid's tresses. Now this species is very different from the kelps that you will see. This looks like string, and we've all seen this. It's very slimy to the touch. Often it has this sort of filamentous algae growing over it as well. And you'll see these guys floating sometimes with a small stone attached to the holdfast beneath it. Okay, so these guys are very small in terms of their diameter, but they can grow up to about 8 meters in length. And sometimes you can find them in shallow waters up to about 5 meters depth, but also in rock pools as well. And you see this all the way along the coast. You can see this map here that shows this all the way along Sussex and the south coast and going up to the West Country, and of course on the west coast of the UK as well. So we have Chordophyllum, which looks like string or brown spaghetti. We also have Laminaria ocroluca. Now this species in actual fact is prefers warm water. Now this gives us some hope for future predicted climate change models, because we are seeing this particular species moving in from the West Country. And it's now moving as far east as the west coast of the Isle of Wight, as you can see here, but it is moving further east. Now, again, this species, in actual fact, looks very similar to the Laminaria species that we have in Sussex, so Laminaria hyperborea, Laminaria digitata, but this is a lot more golden in colour, hence it's a common name, golden kelp. But it's found actually in quite deeper waters, found deeper than Laminaria hyperborea, up to 25 meters in actual fact. But again, this species is not invasive, but it's a really warm water specialist, but we are seeing forests of this species moving eastwards. Okay, and in actual fact it has the same structure and it has the same function as our other Laminaria species, but interestingly with it we get a different biodiversity associated with this particular species, but it will have the same function but a different faunal community associated with it. We also have Saccharina pollicis. So this guy actually, in actual fact, looks like Laminaria digitata outwardly, okay, but it's quite brittle and very hard to the touch, this species. Now, it's found at very deep water. It can be found into 35 meters depth, but the difference with this species, it has a very thick and very clumpy, warty holdfast, okay? And it's darker in colour in actual fact as well. And we do see this species spreading over into Sussex. We also have Wakame, Undaria pinnatifida. This can be found up to 15 meters depth. And again, you could be forgiven. It looks a little bit like Saccharina latissima. This species is invasive. And this has come from Japan, it's coming over, and we do see it living in, similar actually to Saccharina latissima, in estuarine environments. In actual fact, this species is quite important commercially because it is edible as well. Now, let's think about the physical habitat for kelp forest, okay? So as I've already said, in the UK, we've got 7 of the 14 European species. This is because the UK, it has lots of exposed coasts, of course, lots of high wave energy, lots of rocky environments. Now, this is really important for kelp because it prefers that habitat. So as you now know, with their holdfast, as they settle as spores, as these small spores, these baby sporophytes in the water column settling on the rocks, they attach to the rocks, okay? And the kelp forest, they'll grow from anywhere from literally almost 0 meters, 2 meters or so, down to about 30 meters of depth, where we can have light reaching down to those environments. We need clear water. So of course it has to be shallow water for the light to penetrate. Okay, they form dense forests, as you now know, as you can see. And you can see actually, if you're swimming through these kelp forests, it's actually quite beautiful with the amount of biodiversity within them in these clear waters. And they prefer cold water, anywhere between 5 and 20 degrees C in high wave energy environments. But we are seeing, as you now know, a warm water species moving in because temperatures are getting warmer slowly but surely. But at the minute, we're okay in Sussex. The biological habitat of kelp. Now, kelp are very important because they're very productive in their growth. Now, if you think of a terrestrial ecosystem, and terrestrial plants, they grow very slowly, as you know, but kelp can draw down and maximize energy from the sun very efficiently. And in actual fact, kelp can grow up to about 20 to 30 times faster than terrestrial plants. In the UK, we can have kelp species in a month can grow between 1 to 2 feet in a month. So very productive in ideal situations, okay? This means they can draw down all those greenhouse gases very effectively as carbon sponges. They absorb dissolved CO2 in the surrounding water through their photosynthetic ability. This means it increases the level of the pH, which reduces ocean acidification. This is because it makes the water more alkaline, reducing the localized acidification. Very important if you're a crab, if you're a lobster, if you're an oyster, because you don't want to be in an ocean, in an acidic environment where you're not going to be able to grow because you're made of calcium carbonate. So kelp forests are brilliant for doing things like that, of course. Kelp will oxygenate the water. This is advantageous, particularly if you're a vulnerable and juvenile organism. And kelp forests will create what we call a nursery function, which we'll get into in a minute. Now, for juvenile species growing in an environment that's impoverished, that let's say is impacted by climate change and the oceans are warming up, you have to deal with that stress. So that means those species will divert more energy into dealing with the stress rather than somatic growth. That means you see species becoming out of their zone of tolerance, and we see a greater mortality of those species. Now, if you're in a kelp forest, not only is it cool because of the micro shading, but also because of the oxygen, those species will benefit and maximize those nutrients and will grow much more rapidly. Kelp can reduce wave energy, as Sarah already hinted at, and reduce coastal erosion. Up to about 70% of storm waves are mitigated and reduced by having kelp forest there. Because of the canopy, the dense canopy on the surface, it dampens that wave strength and wave energy. They reduce coastal erosion, as I've already said, and they're essential habitat for food provisioning. This is because of the structure and the function that we talked about earlier. This is because they provide an essential nursery function. So if you're a vulnerable organism or juvenile species, you can grow up into the complexity of the habitat from the kelp forest. This is because it reduces predator-prey interaction. So it's very important. If you're a juvenile organism, you grow up in a complex habitat where you can survive and avoid predation, and grow up as an adult. Then you venture out into adult life, and then you repeat the cycle again. So what are the impacts to kelp? So let's think about this. Okay, so what are the hurdles that we can face in and around the world globally? Well, global warming, of course, warming oceans, as you now know, habitat destruction, coastal development is also a big issue. Now, think back to the analogy that I talked about when you had a farmer on the field, cutting the forest down, creating a flat field, okay? Now, if you're doing this in any environment and it has a negative impact, what's happening is you're creating what we call a phase shift. See my last point below here, okay? This is where the ecosystem goes from a steady state to an unstable state, all right? So if you take out the habitat complexity, you take out the structure and its function, okay? And what we're seeing is now in areas, particularly in Sussex, where the kelp has gone from 100% and we're now down to 4% of the original biomass and surface area of that kelp. We're seeing areas that have become impoverished, and now areas that were once rocky are now have this small gravel veneer over the top or sedimentation over it. So this then becomes a phase shift where the kelp will not grow back in those areas. So these are some of the hurdles that we have to actually tackle. Let's think about climate change. On our x-axis here, we have time, okay, going up to present day. And here we have on our y-axis, so carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere, okay? Now, what I've done here is overlay data for the International Panel for Climate Change. This is a conglomerate of governments, scientists, specialists, concerned citizens that get together and talk about the issues of the data related to climate change and how that can be mitigated, all right? And what they're supposed to do is to manipulate and change policy for the better. So as I said before, we go from a carbon emitting society to a carbon absorbing society. But look, if I'm going to highlight this, 1990, we had an IPCC conference. 2000, we had one. And in 2010, we had one. And we've had several more since. But what do you see in this trend in terms of CO2 emissions? In actual fact, we haven't changed our carbon footprint. So we're still emitting CO2 in actual fact at a faster rate. So we're not listening, but I don't want to instill ecological grief with you. We are turning the tide on that, okay? So governments are now calling for a climate crisis, hence all this big activity for active restoration of these coastal ecosystems, not only for kelp, but for salt marsh seagrass, mangrove forests, oyster reefs, coral reefs, and on the land as well. So it's an exciting time to be a conservationist. So if we think to the kelp impacts and the loss of kelp, the east coast of Canada, we've seen 90% loss of kelp in the last 40 years. In the last 4 decades, east coast of Canada have lost 90% of kelp. Staggeringly, Norway have lost 80% of kelp in 20 years. Okay, huge amount of loss. In the UK, on average, we're losing about 300 square miles of kelp per year. This means if we carry on at the same rate of loss in the UK, we will have 0 kelp forest left within the next 80 years by the end of the century. And with a loss of kelp comes an associated loss of biodiversity of up to 90% loss, okay? So think about the commercial fisheries, think about the biodiversity and the complex food webs and the energy flow within those ecosystems and the loss of that. So if we restore the kelp, you breathe life literally back into our coastal ecosystems. And here are the stats that show that and highlight that by the end of the century, UK will have lost its kelp forest. But as I say, I don't want to instill ecological grief because the future is bright. As Sarah said, we've been successful for the last 2 years working for policy changes to get this bylaw over the line. We've now got a protected area of 300 square kilometres in and around Sussex. In actual fact, this is a first for the UK, a government-sanctioned protected area. And within that, we want to restore around about 170 square kilometers, which historically, which is where the kelp forests were 40 years ago. So thank you very much. What I'm going to do now is hand back over to Sarah to wrap up this, this kelp talk. Thank you very much, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ian. That was so interesting. So just really quickly to wrap up before we go to Q&A section, I just wanted to sort of give you a little bit of a what's next section so that you can hopefully wet your whistle for our next webinar in a few weeks' time. So hopefully what you've learned tonight from Ian's part of the webinar is, you know, understanding the different types of kelp that you're going to be seeing here in Sussex, the type of environments in which you'll be finding them, and how things maybe have changed and how we want to monitor that change. So what we'd really like is for anybody that's found this interesting, that wants to get involved, to turn what you're seeing into an official biological record. So some of you may already be doing this. You may be familiar with citizen science recording programs, like, you know, using iRecord, that kind of thing, which is fantastic. And we are harnessing data that comes through anywhere like that, because Sussex Wildlife Trust works in partnership with the Biodiversity Record Centre. They sit within the Wildlife Trust. So we are able to sort of harness data that exists. And also, you know, any data that comes in through the programs that I'm coordinating, Sea Search and Shore Search. It's all going into our big sort of kelp database. But like I said, we are now putting together a separate bespoke recording system just for kelp. And that's what we're going to be talking about in our next webinar in a couple of weeks' time. So I really hope that we'll see some of you guys there. It will be essentially explaining how to use this new system, how to set yourself up as a user on it, and how to turn what you're seeing into records. If you have got records already, please hold on to them. If you want desperately to hand them over, you can get in touch via email. We can sort of put them in a holding thing. We will be able to backdate records. So anything that you've seen sort of, you know, over the course of the summer or anything like that, we can absolutely take those records. So please don't feel that you have to wait. The very basic information that we need at the time being is obviously what you saw. If you know the species, that's great. If not, it doesn't matter. We can go to a lower level of classification, an approximate geolocation, GPS or grid reference, whatever you're using. And then any other information that you can give on top of that is bonus, really, you know, the habitat type, that kind of thing. Ideally, photos are really useful, particularly if you're not totally sure. We will be going through all of this in much more detail in our next webinar, but just if you want to be doing anything in the meantime, this is the sort of very basics as to what we're hoping to get from you. If you want to go one step further and you want to join a proper recording program, if you're a scuba diver, please feel free to join Sea Search. Unfortunately, we've done our Sea Search training for the year. We tend to only run training in the springtime. So that does mean, unfortunately, we won't be able to take any new volunteers on this year. But if you do think it's something that interests you, maybe do some kelp records this summer and come and join us next year for Sea Search. It's a really, really fantastic group of really enthusiastic volunteers that join us on Sea Search. And we've achieved some really fantastic things over the year with our partners nationally. You know, Sea Search has been you know, really, really imperative for getting marine conservation zones designated and getting the management correct in those MCZs once they've been designated. So it is a really, really worthwhile project joining. Additionally, if you're interested specifically in seaweeds, my colleagues at the Marine Conservation Society are also doing a new programme, which I think starts as of today, which is called the Big Seaweed Search. And they are running a whole load of surveys and training events over the course of the next couple of weeks. So if you're interested in getting involved with that, I think the dates are on the website, or you can pop us a message and we'll put you in touch with Kate, who's coordinating all of that. So various surveys, then it's a sort of set number of seaweed you're looking for. So you don't need to be an absolute expert in every single type of seaweed you might find on the shore, but a really nice introduction to the different types of seaweeds you might find, and a nice introduction to citizen science as well. So there's the web link for Sea Search, and like I say, watch this space for details of the next survey. I think that's probably it from us, and so we'll hand back over to Michael to see if we've had any interesting questions to come in and answer.
Very well, thank you, Sarah, thank you, Ian. That was fantastic. You've converted me from moths and butterflies to kelp. I say I'm going to go grab my snorkel now. I'll be out there tomorrow. So we've already got lots of questions coming through. Some of them have been answered in the talk, and there's quite a few. I'll email you the questions, Ian and Sarah, so you can answer them individually, the ones we miss out. But I got some ones here as we went through. So well, some people are already sending in their records of kelp. Christine found fur bellows, Sacchariza polyschides. Is that right, Ian? So I'm good at this. She found that on the wreck of the Indiana, 2 kilometres south of Worthing yesterday. So so keep those records coming in. So now Anita in Eastbourne, she asks, Sarah, can you recommend a good spotter's guide to identifying seaweed? Oh, got the thumbs up there. Where's she gone? There it is.
So this is, it's actually a Sea Search book. So plug away for Sea Search there. This is the Seaweeds of Britain and Ireland, and it's a second edition. It only came out a couple of years ago. And I bought this with my own money. I didn't make work buy it for me or anything. That's how good it is. So it's a really, really good comprehensive guide on seaweeds that you are likely to see as someone on the shore or a diver. It's really useful. It's all pictorial. It gives you guides as to sort of how big things are. So whatever the species is, you can see the size of it. You can see, just like we had in Ian's slides, where it's been spotted around the UK. So you'll know, if you think you found something, it will tell you whether it's plausible or if you're going to be holding a record for something that's never been found there before. So that's a really good one. And that is available on the MCS, Marine Conservation Society's shop. They have all the Sea Search books on there, and they are all really, really good beginner's guides for the various seaweeds, obviously relevant to tonight, but they've got guides for all the different marine creatures, including a very general one as well. So.
Right, thank you, Sarah. Now, there's a question from Curtis earlier on. One just came through from Graham on the same topic. Hi guys, think you're doing a great job. Is there anything happening east of Brighton, as on the maps that I saw? It didn't cover that. We're located in Eastbourne, and we'd really like to try and do what we can for this part of the coast. So what's happening to the east? And Curtis was asking what's happening towards Hastings and Rye.
So what we've got at the moment is a project in the west of Sussex. And the reason that we've stayed in that particular area is because we are learning more and more through anecdotal data that there was kelp over towards Brighton and the eastern side of the county. But where we're working is where we've got like actual historical evidence of kelp. So that's not to say that kelp wasn't elsewhere, but we have real hard evidence of it being there, and it being quite far offshore. Whereas I think probably the stuff over towards Brighton was more of a sort of thin line sort of along the coast. So what we've decided to do is kind of, work on this area to start with. We know that this area is good, it's going to work. And if we're successful here in a few years' time, there's no reason why we can't extend things further out in terms of restoration and potentially active restoration. But for the time being, our kelp recording system is not only for this particular area. We're really happy to take records from everywhere. And one of the important things about this recording system, which we'll talk about more at the next webinar, is that we're also looking for negative records. So if you didn't find kelp, as well as if you did, so that we can map out obviously where kelp is, but where kelp isn't as well. And like I say, it doesn't need to be specifically in this area. We'll cover, the whole of Sussex and beyond. So yeah, do get involved, send us your records. There isn't going to be anything much more than that for the time being, but hopefully that's enough to get you involved in the project at the moment.
Thank you. This one's for Ian, I guess. This is from Kate and Christine had a similar question. How will increasing water temperatures affect the regrowth of kelp and the species diversity?
Again, really good question. So what we see with the species that we have, particularly in Sussex, and the main species, and let's go with Laminaria hyperborea, Laminaria digitata, and Saccharina latissima. They prefer temperatures of anywhere from 5 degrees up to about 20 degrees. But and at the minute, it's perfect. So we're at perfect temperature for that. And we don't really see our oceans getting much warmer, particularly in around Sussex, any much warmer than 20 degrees in our summers. But what we are seeing is this encroachment of Laminaria ochroluca coming in from the west coast, and it's, I feel like a weatherman when I'm sort of talking about this, you do see this species sort of coming in from the west, and it's now on the west coast of the Isle of Wight, and it is moving more towards the east as waters or shallower waters are warming up. Now, so what we will see potentially, if our waters do increase in temperatures in Sussex, if they do, and it's going to be a while, it's going to be a long time before they do, but if they do, you will see this starting of this mixture of Laminaria ochroluca, or the golden kelp, mixing in with the current species that we have. Now, at the moment, it's not a problem, okay? And what we're seeing is that it still creates what we call the same structure and the same function. So it still generates biodiversity, it still draws down these greenhouse gases, it still creates what we call a nursery function for many organisms. But if you have, let's call it a monoculture of Laminaria ochroluca, you will see a change in the biodiversity. Now, that's not to say that's a bad thing, but what I'm going to say, what I will say is that it will change the community structure of organisms. There will be the same trophic levels in terms of apex predators going down to primary consumers, but the biodiversity might be slightly different to what we see now in terms of bass, cuttlefish, bream, all those sorts of things. So you might see a slightly different community of organisms, but you'll still get the same sort of biomass and the same functions of the ecosystem.
Thank you. I think it's time for one more question. It's from Chris, and I wanted to know the answer to this as well. So from Chris and Michael, on one of your monitoring slides, Sarah, you mentioned that you'd be tagging certain species in the future. Are you able to identify which species these might be at the moment?
Yeah, so this is a really exciting project. It hasn't got underway yet. We're working in partnership with some other universities, and essentially it's actually a project we've been really lucky to be able to pretty much piggyback on. They invited us to get involved. Oh, I think there's some feedback. Michael, maybe you can mute yourself. Sorry. Yeah, they invited us to get involved in a wider project, which is really nothing to do with the kelp restoration project, but we saw it as a really fantastic opportunity to basically add another stream of research to our belt. So the species that at the moment we're looking at, I think, is black bream, bass, possibly one other. But what we're hoping to do is increase the project that's already happening via the partners, add a few different species to that, possibly even looking at crabs and lobsters. They are a little bit more difficult to tag because they molt their shells. So you have to be a bit careful about trying to tag older individuals and that kind of thing. But essentially the bigger animals that are going to be making use of that kelp, or newly restored kelp, and see if we can track the changes in their movements and in their behaviors to sort of basically prove that they're utilizing the newly restored kelp as a nursery ground or as a feeding ground, or just an area, you know, that they're moving around in. So it's a long-term project. Hopefully it's going to be something that lasts a good number of years, and we can see the changes over time as hopefully the kelp is restoring itself. So yeah, really, really exciting project. So do watch this space about that one. We'll definitely be talking about that a lot when it gets underway.
Brilliant. Thank you. That sounds fascinating. Great. Look forward to that. So before we finish, I'll just share my screen a second here. This going to work? There we are. I'll just share my screen just to show you about some of the upcoming talks we have. Here we go. Hopefully that's working. There we are. So Now, it's National Marine Week, which seems to last about 2 weeks, National Marine Week. Get a bit carried away there, but we have another talk coming up about ghost gear. Now, Nikki from the Wildlife Trust and Christine from Ghost Fishing UK will be talking about all the nets and fishing gear and discarded debris you find in the sea and the work they're doing to tidy up the sea. And we're back on land, but there'll be some shore crabs in this talk. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie will be talking about the wildlife and landscapes of the South Downs on August the 17th, going all the way from the wave cut platform right to the top of the Downs, from shore crabs to Chardonnay. And if you enjoyed this evening's webinar, as I always say, please consider making a donation to support the work of Sussex Wildlife Trust. There'll be a chance to make a donation at the end. Or if you're not a member of the Wildlife Trust, please consider joining us. Now, hopefully when this talk ends, there should be a screen where you'll find some links to make donations or join the trust. Also, there's some links there to Ian and Sarah's previous incredible talks, which almost broke the internet with 1,000 people, almost broke my Zoom account. And also links to their Q&A, also links to Ella's talk about the tour of the marine conservation zones. If you don't find that page on your screen, go to the Wildlife Trust main site, wildlifetrust.org.uk, find the hare there and click on his ears. It'll take you to the webinar extra pages. So just to finish, a big thank you again to Sarah and Ian. There's been hundreds of people watching tonight. As I always say to our presenters, it's a shame you can't hear the round of applause, but I have provided one here. There's a nice little fellow there to give you a round of applause. So thank you again to Sarah and Ian for this evening's talk, and we'll see you in a few weeks' time for part 2. And thank you to everybody for watching this evening and for your continued support of Sussex Wildlife Trust. So press this. So I want to press this here. So there we are. So there we go. Big wave, folks. Good to see you again. And we'll see you all again soon. Take care. Bye.